In October of the year 2000, Games Workshop, the hobby titan we know today, was at a historical financial low. With a stock price trading low as $1.72 per share in September of 2001 and a yearly revenue of $110 million, a nominal increase over the previous year, one might wonder how they became the hobby dragon resting atop a pile of gold that we know them as today. What happened? I'm not a business expert, so I can't say for sure, but my money is on a little game called the Lord of the Rings strategy battle game.
The Lord of the Rings, battle games in Middle-earth.
Released alongside the films in 2001 to 2003, Games Workshop's profits skyrocketed, increasing from that low stock price of $1.72 all the way to $7.83 in December of 2003 when the final film hit theaters. This and Games Workshop's yearly revenue would continue to increase well into 2004 to a high of $17 a share and a yearly revenue of $270 million, an increase of over 240% since 2001. While I may credit their financial success to this string of releases, the game's creator, Rick Priestley, who was also part of the team that created Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40,000, claims that the Lord of the Rings stories are the reason for Warhammer and ultimately Games Workshop in general.
You know, if anyone is going to make models in a game for this, it ought to be me. Well, sorry, Games Workshop, not me. I want to do this. None of the guys at Games Workshop, none of the top team really were interested. Without Lord of the Rings, there would be no Warhammer, there would be no fantasy. Even though we were paying an 8% royalty, we still made more money out of selling Lord of the Rings than we did out of Warhammer. The margins were better.
I got into the Lord of the Rings strategy battle game back in 2003, over 20 years ago.
Tuesday, April 22nd, 2003. We went to Gurnee Mills today for fun and lunch. Katie found a cute corduroy jacket, and Scott finally talked me into a box of Uruk-hai game figures from Games Workshop, complete with paints. He really likes them and spent hours painting them. Who knows? Maybe he's developed a seriously expensive hobby that will last.
Oh, my mother. 2003 Miniac mom has no idea the amount of cash I would spend on that sweet, sweet plastic crack. Little did she know that it had become my career. The Lord of the Rings game was my gateway into the hobby of painting miniatures and wargaming. My mom is a huge fan of the stories and preferred those models to the demons of Warhammer. Shout out to all my fellow sheltered Midwestern kids. The Simpsons? Never heard of it. South Park? Only at sleepovers with friends whose parents have questionable morality. When I did eventually move over to those other games my mom wasn't so keen on, I left behind what now is called the Middle-earth strategy battle game. I haven't painted a Lord of the Rings figure in over 20 years, and today, we're gonna fix that. While painting is definitely my forte, I'd love to be able to sculpt miniatures as well. The sponsor of this video, Skillshare, definitely has a few opportunities for me to make that happen. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives with thousands of classes led by industry experts across sculpting, painting, board game design, productivity, and more. There are literally thousands of classes, so the likelihood of finding the knowledge you're after is high. Skillshare can help you take your career, skills, hobbies, passions, and side hustles to the next level with a learn by doing model. I'm always struggling with learning a new topic theoretically, and it's only until I actually sit down and get my hands dirty that I fully grasp a topic. To learn how to sculpt a miniature, the options are endless, but I was pretty intrigued by a couple of options that show me how to sculpt a full miniature from start to finish. It's such an empowering feeling to sit down and know that I'll have completed a major milestone by the end. It really excites me and encourages me to learn. There are even classes about more specific topics like sculpting correct anatomy for faces, cutting up your model for 3D printing and casting, and more. Skillshare is always improving from smarter class categories that get you the information you want faster to new topics altogether, like creative careers, creative inspiration, and AI and innovation. One new change I'm fond of is how you can search and sort by specific software. So if you have a pre-existing skill set in something, you can continue to build on that knowledge by getting what you need very easily. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Get started today. Thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this portion of today's episode. Now back to painting my Lord of the Rings figure. Because most Lord of the Rings figures are from the early 2000s, they look like models from the early 2000s. But while browsing the internet one night, I discovered these sick Easterling models. And then I found these ones, and then these ones, and then these ones. Am I starting an Easterling army? No, Scott, bad. Let's start small. I picked up a blister of the Rudeby and Brugir, Heroes of Rhun. Your guess is as good as mine. I was a little concerned about this model at first because of the 15+ rating on the site. Firstly, I'm 12. And secondly, 15+ means that GW is casting this thing in resin, and they don't have the greatest track record. Despite my fears, the cast was shockingly great. Sure, there were some standard resin issues like a bendy spear shaft and some spindly bits left behind by the casting process, but for a Forge World model, this was the best I've ever seen in my entire career. Maybe GW has figured out what every boutique company in our entire industry has known for 10+ years? One can only hope. With an X-Acto knife for cleanup and some super glue for assembly, the model went together easily. Bonus points for this arrangement of tools on my desk.
Nice.
After I was done being an absolute child, I did a tiny bit of gap filling with some Milliput, and then I was ready for some primer. With the full model assembled, I was again surprised by how small the model was. The picture on the site makes the Mini feel Space Marine-ish size, but that is definitely not the case. Rick Priestley also has something to say about this.
The bigger you make a figure, the more it costs to make. In particular, you hit a certain point whereby you have to start breaking the figure down into components. The minute a figure is 2 components and not 1, you've doubled the price. I know that sounds silly, but it's twice as much casting, it's twice as much packing. The cost of making miniatures can be reduced if you make single-piece castings, but that means making them slightly smaller. You get more figures on a mold, slightly smaller.
Harkening back to 20+ years ago when I last painted Lord of the Rings miniatures, I primed the sky in black and kept it there. No fancy undercoats needed for where we're going. And where we're going is rose gold non-metallic metal. I often forget that there are so many different types of gold, and I wanted to try out something new. If you're new here, NMM is the practice of replicating a metallic effect, but with flat acrylic paints. After a bit of computer time, I picked out my palette of colors that I thought would work. I began with a simple base coat of maroon. Next, we need to do some planning.
One of the most important things when it comes to executing on non-metallic metal is picking a perspective. And the most important perspective is often called the money shot. It's the shot that's like most impressive, the shot that you would take a photograph from. And for this guy, it's pretty simple. It's somewhere right in here where you can see all the important details. His chest is open to you. It's the photo the company took the box art picture from. Now the second perspective is gonna be probably something like this. In this point of view, you can't really see any of the other metallic bits, but you can see the arm and the back of the forearm. And it's important that it's kind of isolated because one of the issues with doing non-metallic metal is that the specular highlight, or the brightest point on the metal, doesn't move as you move the model around. So if I paint it from this perspective, you won't see the other parts of the NMM not working when you rotate it to this point. Similarly, the third perspective I care about is probably right here. You get a really satisfying look of the other arm. You see this back piece really nicely, and you don't see anything else. So those conflicting viewpoints won't mess with each other.
All right, with our 3 perspectives selected, we can start highlighting. I'll begin with a step in between my maroon and my skin tone looking paint. Whenever I have a question about where I should paint or whether or not something looks good, I'll always answer that question by looking at one of my 3 important perspectives.
While I'm painting NMM, I'll do a lot of useless brush strokes, like edge highlighting stuff that I know will get run over by future highlights. And that type of painting is entirely diagnostic. I'm just doing it to see if all of the other things that I'm doing will result in a paint job that looks like what I'm trying to accomplish, which in this case is a rose gold NMM.
It's often a bit hard to tell if you're fully on the right track with this initial highlight. Nothing is ever going to look metallic right away, so I jumped up to a brighter color and started to work on the helmet. I wanted to first solve the helmet, and by that I mean I want it to start looking metallic. If it starts to look right, I'll move on to the rest of the armor. I don't want to waste a bunch of time painting the entire figure with the wrong idea or the wrong paints. Early on, I identified a problem.
Sorry if there are squeaky sounds in the backgrounds of this recording. My dog has a toy. Bullet, come here. Come here, Bullet. Everyone on the internet wants to see you. Oh, Bullet, come here. Come on. There she is. There she is. Gotta pay the dog tax. I'm sitting here and painting this helmet, and I can already realize something that I constantly realize while painting, especially NMM, and that's that I just left behind too much shadow. I like the level of brightness that I have, but that first intermediate layer I did was probably too small and not aggressive enough. And so what I'm gonna do now is bring back more of that previous layer to make the shadow smaller and maybe improve the blending a little bit.
With our course corrected, I felt confident moving on to the rest of the armor with the same paints and procedure, adding a bright highlight and then knocking it back with a diluted version of the last layer to give it some smoothness. With some of that skin tone color and an off-white yellow and white, I mixed my final highlight for the armor. The last layer of highlights we did definitely took the longest and is the one layer of paint that is largely responsible for making things look shiny. But this final and much quicker highlight is also very important. I applied tiny bright lights to really pump up the jams. You don't need a lot to get a lot of value out of this paint. Very sparing highlights do a lot of work. With my Easterling's armor looking bright and brilliant, I moved on to the red cloth. Obviously, I'm being a little sacrilegious with my color choices, so let's keep it up. Instead of doing a dark maroon like depicted in the films, I chose a very saturated red and started base coating with a duller, darker version of that red. I could have used the same maroon I used for the armor, but I wanted to differentiate the two parts of the model a bit more. With that base coat down, I mixed an intermediate color between that and my juicy red and applied my first highlight. Because this fabric isn't as shiny as my metal, I don't have to think super hard about perspectives and where highlights and shadows go. The upward-facing surfaces and the details higher up on the model get the majority of highlights, basically. With that layer of highlight complete, I again jumped up pretty fast to my fully saturated red. And when you do something like that, you have to be prepared to do some kind of blending to link up the layers. On larger surfaces like the inside of his cape, I'll do that by leveraging wet blending, mixing still wet paint on the model to get a transition. With that layer blended in nicely, I do one final highlight only on the higher up details with that same red mixed with a little bit of white. I only apply really small highlights of this slightly pinkish color because I don't want the red cloth to read as pink, but a small highlight does a lot to boost the contrast. Next up, I moved on to the black fabric, which is very simple but important for the scheme. It breaks up all the warm colors really nicely because it's darker than all of them, but also because I chose a cold color to highlight with. This color contrasts nicely with the entirely warm palette I've used so far without stealing the show away from the shiny armor or the really nice red cloth. Lastly, for the metals, I had to paint the weird spear axe hybrid thing. First, I checked the model from the perspective that I care about. That lower left part seems to be hanging around in the areas that are important to me, so I'll put a really bright highlight right there. In the world of non-metallic metal, this is kind of the worst thing to paint, a big flat surface. A big silver surface is basically a crappy mirror. It's gonna reflect whatever is in front of it, all things not on the model and visible. So a lot of guesswork that I'm not gonna do. I'm basically going to somewhat randomly decide how to paint this thing, or rather, I'm much less concerned with realism and instead just want something that looks kind of shiny. The best part of finishing this part of the model is that I get to do it all over again on the other side. Yay! I like how I'm complaining, but I'm also the person who chose NMM in the first place. You made your bed! The last detail on the model were some gems, or what I think are gems. I could have painted them to all look like rose gold, but I think this breaks up the paint job a little bit better. With a dark brown base coat, I began to highlight the lower right side of the oval with a dark red, and then I continued to brighten that up several times, getting smaller and smaller. The key to gems is to leave behind more dark shadow than you think. At the very end, I do one last highlight with orange, like a crescent moon along the bottom edge, and then I hit the top left part with a tiny white dot. This white dot, like the bright highlight on our dude's helmet, is a specular highlight, the part of the object that's reflecting the majority of our light source right at the perspectives we care about. With the model done, it's time to finish up the base. I applied some basing texture and then base coated it with some dark blue that I used for the axe and the black parts. While the paint was still wet, I roughly wet blended on pure white to get a bit of highlighting on his tactical rock that he's standing on, and also toward the outer edge of the base. Next, I applied some watered down dry pigments to get the base to look dusty. It's tricky to know what pigments will look like once they're dry, so I keep a hair dryer handy and just blast it with some heat occasionally to see what it'll look like, and then make any adjustments necessary. With that done, I sealed my fate with a silky black base rim. My journey back to Middle-earth was a lovely one. I love painting simple board game figures because most times they're not drowning in details that aren't fun to paint. They get straight to the point. The downside is the models aren't the highest quality. With the Middle-earth strategy battle game, not only are the models delightfully simple, but they're also mostly cast in GW's high-quality plastic. So it's the best of both worlds. I had written off the game and the models more so as a product of its time, lacking any forward progress, but I can happily say that I was wrong. There are quite a few modern and beautiful figures that I would happily paint. With the upcoming release of War of the Rohirrim and a new box set to celebrate that release from Games Workshop, I think I'll have quite a few awesome models to pick from in the future. I'd be remiss to mention that the reason I painted a Lord of the Rings figure this month was because every single month I put out a poll on my Patreon asking my patrons what mini they want to see me paint next month. And this last poll, they voted on Lord of the Rings, a result that I did not expect. If you want to cast your vote on what model I paint next month, you can find my Patreon linked in the description below. Also, as a patron, you get access to an extended cut of this video. So if you want to see more painting details and also hear my input about why I made certain choices, you can find that video on Patreon, as well as many other videos in that format in the past. My patrons are honestly awesome people, and they've been enabling me to make this hobby of painting figures a career for many years. I've been doing this for almost 9 years now, and I've had a Patreon for quite a significant chunk of that, and those people have always been there supplying me with a monthly revenue month after month. And so I really can't thank them enough. You guys are awesome. I appreciate what you do for my business so much. And hopefully I can continue to give them more agency in my channel so they can make fun choices like what model I paint. If you like the channel and you want to support my miniature painting education on the internet, there are many ways you can do that. Obviously the Patreon, I already mentioned that, but also my web store linked down in the description has lots of really cool stuff. Obviously merch like this sick black and red tie-dye hoodie with a bat icon right here, and also a big back design, but also other hobby tools, like a really nice cutting mat that's really big and thick and self-healing, has an imperial grid on one side and a metric on the other. My brush box that you can put brushes in and any kind of hobby tools that you want, and a couple other things. You can find that all links down in the description below. Subscribe or die! And most importantly, don't forget to paint me!